Sarah is 41. She spent 15 years building a career in corporate law. Senior partner by 38. Clients who trusted her completely. A professional identity she had constructed with care and sustained through considerable sacrifice. Last autumn, she sat in a meeting she had chaired dozens of times before, looked at the room, and understood, not thought, not decided, understood, that she could not continue. She submitted her notice 3 weeks later. She cannot explain it. Her therapist calls it burnout. Her husband calls it a midlife crisis. Jung would call it something else entirely. The term midlife crisis was coined in 1965 by the psychoanalyst Elliott Jaques, who was studying creative artists and found a distinctive pattern in their work in the middle decades of life. The term was later popularized and subsequently trivialized, reduced to the cliché of the sports car and the younger partner. What Jung described decades earlier was not a crisis in the colloquial sense. It was a structural transition in the organization of the psyche, a transition that, when understood, is not a breakdown. It is an invitation. This video explores ideas from depth psychology for reflection, not as therapy. If you are working through difficult material, a qualified analyst or therapist can help in ways a video cannot. Sarah, the case in this video, is hypothetical, a composite constructed to illustrate how Jung's theory of individuation applies to a recognizable pattern at midlife. Jung's concept of individuation is the most comprehensive and, arguably, the most misunderstood in his entire framework. It has been absorbed into the self-help vocabulary as a synonym for self-improvement. It is not. In the technical sense Jung used, individuation is a process, not a goal, not a technique, not a program. It is the process by which the psyche moves toward its own wholeness. And the move is not voluntary in the ordinary sense. It is, in many cases, coerced by the psyche itself. The definition Jung offered in the Essays on the Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, The Collected Works Volume 7, is precise. 8 words. The key term is homogeneous. Not excellent. Not fulfilled. Not healed. Homogeneous, of one substance, no longer divided against itself. Jung's individuation is not about becoming better. It is about becoming coherent. And coherence, in the Jungian sense, requires integrating precisely what was excluded in the process of building the first half persona. The first half of life, in Jung's schema, is oriented toward adaptation. The task of the first half is to establish an ego, a persona, a functional identity that can navigate the social world. This requires selectivity. The ego cannot integrate everything. It must choose a direction, a role, a set of values and capacities. What it does not choose, what is incompatible with the chosen direction, accumulates in the shadow. For 30 or 40 years, this arrangement functions. Then something changes. In the Collected Works, Volume 8, Jung described what changes at midlife as a shift in the center of gravity of the psyche. The ego, which has oriented itself outward during the first half of life, toward achievement, recognition, social belonging, begins to feel the pull of an orientation it cannot name. A pull toward interiority, toward questions it has been too busy to ask, toward contents it has been too committed to its persona to acknowledge. This pull is individuation beginning. It does not feel, from inside, like growth. It feels like loss. The reason individuation feels like loss is that what must be relinquished at midlife is the very structure that produced the success. The first half persona, for Sarah, the persona of the relentlessly competent corporate lawyer, is not relinquished willingly. It is too identified with the ego. When the persona begins to feel hollow, the ego experiences the hollowness as failure. It looks for explanations in the wrong places. It recalibrates the external conditions, a different firm, a new specialization, a sabbatical, a sports car. The external adjustments do not address what has actually shifted. James Hollis, who has written extensively on the psychology of midlife from a Jungian perspective, makes a distinction that clarifies what Sarah is experiencing. He distinguishes between the provisional life, the life organized around the expectations of others, the persona, the program one absorbed in the first half, and the examined life, which begins when the provisional life becomes insufficient. The provisional life is not a mistake. It is what the first half requires. It becomes insufficient not because it fails, but because the psyche has completed a phase and begun another. For Sarah, the moment in the meeting was not a collapse. It was a recognition. The provisional life of the senior partner, organized around excellence, correctability, measurable outcomes, had reached its limit not because it failed, but because the psyche had accumulated, behind it, a mass of unlived contents that could no longer be deferred. The contents were not dark in the dramatic sense. They were the questions she had not asked, the grief she had not processed, the creative life she had placed on hold at 26 in service of the career, the spiritual dimension she had dismissed as irrelevant to a working lawyer. Jung wrote that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of the morning. The program of the morning is for building. The program of the afternoon is for something different. He did not specify precisely what. Because the afternoon program is individual, it emerges from the specific shadow material each person has accumulated. But its direction is inward, toward what was excluded, toward the questions the first half program had no room for. This is why the external explanations for Sarah's decision are insufficient. Burnout explains the fatigue, but not the recognition. Midlife crisis, as the colloquial understanding frames it, implies a temporary aberration to be corrected. What Jung's framework offers is the opposite interpretation. The recognition Sarah had in the meeting was accurate. The structure she had been sustaining had become incompatible with the psyche's next requirement. Walking away was not failure. It was the beginning of the most demanding psychological work of her life. The difficulty of this interpretation is that it offers no immediate program. It does not tell Sarah what to do next. Individuation, as a process, cannot be administered or accelerated. What it requires, initially, is what most professionals are least equipped to provide: the capacity to dwell in uncertainty without resolving it prematurely, to stay in the fog, as it were, long enough for the next direction to emerge from the psyche's own movement. What Sarah's case represents is not a personal failure or an unusual crisis. It represents the midlife transition as Jung understood it, structurally necessary, psychically meaningful, and almost universally misread by the culture it occurs in. The culture reads it as aberration. The Jungian reading reads it as signal. The signal is that individuation has begun, and has begun in the way it most commonly begins, not through deliberate choice, but through the persona's collapse under the weight of what it has been excluding. Consider the cultural reading of the midlife transition more carefully. The dominant narrative offers two responses. The first is correction, return to the program, with adjustments, more rest, better boundaries, a different context for the same persona. The second is replacement, leave the career, reinvent the identity, begin again. Neither addresses what Jung identified as the actual psychological task. The task is not to restore the first half program or replace it with a new one. The task is to integrate what the first half program excluded. For Sarah, integration does not mean abandoning rigor and becoming a free spirit. It means acknowledging that rigor was one dimension of a personality that has other dimensions, equally real, which have been underdeveloped. The question individuation poses is not, who should I become instead? It is, who have I already been, in the parts of the self that the persona never had room for? 3 questions, for those who recognize something of Sarah's position. First, what has the structure of your first half-life required you to defer? Not to abandon, to defer. The deferred material does not disappear. It waits, with increasing impatience, for the second half to give it room. Second, what would it mean to orient toward interiority rather than achievement? Not to abandon achievement, to add to it a dimension of inquiry that achievement alone cannot provide. This is the shift Jung identified as the psychological task of the second half. It is not a retreat from the world. It is a different relationship with it. Third, what feeling arose in you when you read that the persona's collapse was not a failure, but a signal? The quality of that response, relief, resistance, skepticism, recognition, is itself information. It tells you where you stand in relation to the transition, whether it has begun for you, and whether the culture's reading of it has taken hold more fully than the psyche's own. Sarah, in the months after leaving the firm, did not find immediate clarity. She spent 3 months, by her own description, not knowing what to do with unstructured time. She began, for the first time since law school, to read for pleasure. She found herself drawn to texts on depth psychology, on religious experience, on questions she had dismissed at 25 as impractical. The individuation process does not announce its direction immediately. It proceeds at its own pace, and the ego, accustomed to directing the schedule, finds this profoundly uncomfortable. Before we close, this video is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not therapy and not a substitute for professional mental health support. If you are navigating a midlife transition, working with a depth-oriented analyst offers something a video cannot provide: a sustained, supported engagement with the psychic material that the transition surfaces. The individuation process, when entered consciously, is among the most productive engagements available to an adult. It requires time, attention, and, in most cases, skilled guidance. Below this video is a link to 5 questions for beginning shadow work, the process most directly relevant to the individuation task of midlife. If this kind of inquiry matters to you, subscribe. We publish 1 essay each Sunday. This is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. If you are struggling, please seek qualified help.